January 17, 1943. Philippine Sea. 0347 hours. The darkness beneath the waves was absolute. In the cramped control room of Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-21, 37 men breathed the same stale air, recycled through filters that smelled of machine oil and human sweat. The only sounds were the rhythmic ping of the hydrophone and the soft whir of electric motors running at their quietest setting. Lieutenant Commander Kanji Matsumura stood motionless beside the periscope well, his hand resting on the cold steel, feeling the vibration of the sea through the hull. Above them, somewhere in the blackness, an American destroyer prowled. The sonar operator, Petty Officer Hideaki Nomura, pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. His eyes were closed, not in prayer, but in concentration. He was listening to the ocean, to the language of propeller wash and metal hulls cutting through water. Then he heard it, a new sound. Not the steady throb of diesel engines or the high-pitched whine of turbines. This was different. A sharp, rapid clicking, like the tapping of a metal rod against a steel drum, repeating in precise intervals. Ping, ping, ping. His blood turned cold. He had heard veterans describe this sound in the barracks at Kure Naval Base, their voices low and haunted. But hearing it described and hearing it hunt were two entirely different experiences. "Captain," Nomura whispered, though whispers carried in submarines. "Active sonar. They're pinging us." Every man in that control room understood what those words meant. The Americans weren't searching anymore. They had found them. In the opening months of the Pacific War, the submariners of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been the silent predators of the ocean, the unseen daggers aimed at the heart of American naval power. They had trained for years in the cold waters off Hokkaido, diving deeper and staying submerged longer than their counterparts in any other navy. They were taught that their submarines, the products of Japanese engineering excellence, were instruments of strategic warfare, capable of turning the tide of battle through stealth and surprise. The I-class submarines, large fleet boats designed for long-range operations, carried 6 torpedo tubes forward and the hopes of an empire on their steel backs. The men who crewed these vessels were volunteers, chosen for their technical skill and psychological resilience. Submarine duty was considered an honor, a chance to strike at the enemy from the depths where aircraft could not reach and surface ships could not see. In December 1941 and throughout early 1942, Japanese submarines had operated with relative impunity across the Pacific, sinking merchant vessels, shelling coastal installations, and even launching reconnaissance floatplanes over Pearl Harbor and Sydney Harbor. The submariners returned to bases like Truk and Kwajalein with tales of successful attacks and minimal opposition. American anti-submarine warfare, they were told, was primitive, reliant on visual searches and luck. But by January 1943, everything had changed. The ocean itself had become an enemy. The clicking grew louder in Nomura's headphones. Ping, ping, ping. Each pulse was a question shouted into the dark, and the I-21's hull was the answer. Sound waves traveled through water at nearly 1,500 meters per second, striking the submarine's steel skin and bouncing back to the American destroyer above. With each returning echo, the enemy calculated distance, depth, bearing. The Americans no longer needed to see their target. They could hear it, measure it, map its position with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. Commander Matsumura ordered the dive deeper. "Take us to 150 meters. Rig for silent running." Throughout the submarine, men moved without speaking, their cloth-soled shoes making no sound against the deck plates. Valves were turned with agonizing slowness to prevent the telltale squeal of metal on metal. The electric motors were throttled back to their minimum speed, just enough to maintain steerage. Every non-essential system was powered down. The ventilation fans stopped. The temperature began to rise immediately. This was the reality of submarine warfare that no amount of training could fully prepare a man for. The absolute helplessness of being hunted in three-dimensional space by an enemy who possessed technological superiority. The sonar that tracked them was the American QC series, an active echo-ranging system that had been refined throughout 1942 into a devastatingly effective hunting tool. Paired with this detection system were weapons designed specifically to kill submarines. Depth charges. The first one detonated 400 meters astern. Even at that distance, the explosion was catastrophic to the senses. The shock wave traveled through the water faster than sound travels through air, hitting the submarine's hull with a physical force that rattled every bolt, every weld, every man's bones. The lights flickered. Cork insulation rained down from the overhead. Matsumura gripped the periscope housing to keep his feet. In the after-torpedo room, a young sailor vomited into a bucket, the sound obscenely loud in the sudden silence that followed the blast. Then came the second charge. Closer. 300 meters. The hull groaned, a deep, metallic scream that seemed to come from the submarine itself, as if the vessel were crying out in pain. Gauge faces cracked. A steam pipe joint began to weep. The deck tilted 5 degrees to starboard as the helmsman struggled to maintain trim with compressed air hissing into ballast tanks to compensate for the shockwave's effect on buoyancy. Ping, ping, ping. The Americans were correcting their aim. The men of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been raised on the warrior code of Bushido, taught from childhood that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor, that fear was a weakness to be conquered through spiritual discipline. But the depth-charge barrage challenged these teachings in ways that ritual suicide and banzai charges never could. This was not a death faced with sword in hand or met in a moment of decisive action. This was waiting in darkness while invisible explosions walked toward you, each one a coin flip between survival and annihilation. It was industrial murder conducted with mathematical precision. Lieutenant Ichiro Sasaki, the I-21's executive officer, had served in submarines since 1938. He had torpedoed 2 American freighters in the early months of the war and considered himself immune to fear. But as the third depth charge exploded, this one barely 200 meters off the port beam, he found himself counting his heartbeats, measuring his life in the intervals between detonations. His hands were shaking. He clasped them behind his back so the enlisted men wouldn't see. What the Japanese submariners had expected was a war of equals, a test of skill and courage between worthy opponents. They had studied the American Navy's peacetime doctrine, which emphasized surface fleet actions and carrier aviation. Anti-submarine warfare had been a secondary concern, an afterthought in a naval service built around battleships and cruisers. Intelligence reports from 1941 had confirmed that American destroyers were poorly equipped for submarine hunting, lacking effective detection equipment and trained operators. What they encountered instead was an enemy that had transformed its entire approach to undersea warfare with terrifying speed. The Americans had taken the lessons of the Atlantic, where German U-boats and British escorts had been locked in mortal combat since 1939, and applied them with industrial efficiency to the Pacific. By 1943, every American destroyer, destroyer escort, and patrol craft was being fitted with increasingly sophisticated sonar systems. Training schools at San Diego and Pearl Harbor were graduating sonar operators who could interpret echo returns with an almost artistic sensitivity, distinguishing between schools of fish, thermal layers, wrecks, and submarines with unerring accuracy. And once a submarine was detected, the Americans attacked with a relentlessness that seemed to embody their entire national character, overwhelming force applied without hesitation or mercy. The fourth depth charge exploded directly above the I-21, 100 meters up. The world became noise and violence. The submarine rolled 30 degrees to port. Men were thrown against bulkheads. In the galley, dishes shattered. The main lighting failed completely, leaving only the dim red glow of emergency lamps. Water sprayed from a dozen small leaks where gaskets had been compressed beyond their tolerances. The chief of the boat, a veteran named Tanaka who had survived the Russo-Japanese War and the Great Kanto earthquake, moved through the compartments with a damage control team, his face set in an expression that revealed nothing. But his crew could see his hands working faster than normal, applying wooden plugs and canvas wraps to the leaking seams, and they understood that speed meant desperation. In the conning tower, Matsumura faced an impossible calculation. Stay deep and die slowly as the depth charges walked closer with each adjustment of the American sonar. Surface and die quickly under the destroyer's guns. Or attempt to evade, knowing that any increase in speed would make more noise, would give the sonar operators above an even clearer target to track. He had read the action reports from submarines that had survived depth charge attacks. The ones who lived were the ones who became ghosts, who drifted on silent electric motors through thermal layers that bent sonar waves, who shut down every system that made sound, who waited with almost religious patience for the enemy to give up and move on. But the Americans rarely gave up. The fifth charge. 150 meters, slightly aft. A welded seam in the pressure hull cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. The spray of seawater was pressurized, a jet cutting through the air. Two sailors wrestled a collision mat over the breach while a third pumped a wooden wedge into the gap behind it. The mat held, but everyone knew it was temporary. At this depth, the sea pressure was nearly 15 kilograms per square centimeter. The ocean wanted to come in, and it was only a matter of time before it found a way. Ping, ping, ping. The sound was inside Nomura's head now, behind his eyes, in his teeth. He reported bearings and ranges in a monotone voice that had abandoned all emotion. Contact bearing 015, range 1200 meters and closing. Second contact bearing 045, range 1500 meters. There were two destroyers now. They were coordinating their attacks, one holding sonar contact while the other maneuvered into position for depth charge runs. It was a tactic the Americans called creeping attack, and it was devastatingly effective. The technology that hunted them had been developed in laboratories and research facilities across America, born from a marriage of physics and engineering that represented the industrial nation's approach to warfare. The QC sonar system generated a pulse of sound at a specific frequency, projected through a transducer mounted in the destroyer's hull. When that pulse struck a solid object, a submarine's steel hull, it reflected back. The time delay between transmission and reception, measured in milliseconds, revealed the target's range. The direction from which the echo returned revealed bearing. By transmitting multiple pulses and comparing the returns, operators could determine if the target was moving and in which direction. But sonar was not a perfect system. Thermal layers in the ocean, boundaries between water masses of different temperatures, could bend sound waves, creating false echoes or masking real targets. Suspended particles, schools of fish, and the seafloor itself all created acoustic clutter. Operating a sonar effectively required not just equipment but human skill, the ability to distinguish signal from noise in an endless stream of acoustic data. The Americans trained their operators obsessively. At the Fleet Sound School in San Diego, sonar operators spent weeks in darkened rooms wearing headphones, learning to identify the acoustic signatures of different submarines, the distinctive propeller cavitation of a Japanese I-boat, the deeper throb of a German Type 7 U-boat, the quieter electric motors of a submarine running submerged. They learned to track contacts in 3 dimensions, to predict submarine maneuvers, to guide their ship's captain into attack position with precise bearing and range information. By 1943, the best American sonar operators could detect a submarine at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters under ideal conditions. The depth charges they directed their ships to drop were equally sophisticated weapons. The Mark VI depth charge contained 300 pounds of Torpex explosive, more powerful than TNT, fused to detonate at a preset depth controlled by a hydrostatic mechanism. A single depth charge exploding within 20 feet of a submarine's pressure hull could crush it like a tin can. Even a near miss could cause catastrophic damage, ruptured pipes, electrical failures, flooding, loss of depth control. The shock wave could kill men through blast injuries even if the hull remained intact, rupturing lungs and internal organs. American destroyers carried between 40 and 60 depth charges, stored in racks at the stern and on side-mounted K-gun projectors. In a typical attack, they dropped them in patterns designed to create a 3-dimensional cube of explosions around the submarine's estimated position. Then they would circle back, regain sonar contact, adjust for the submarine's attempted evasion, and attack again. And again. Until the submarine surfaced, or sank, or somehow escaped. The I-21 had nowhere to escape to. The 6th depth charge detonated so close that the hull rang like a struck bell. The sound was physical, a pressure wave that seemed to pass through flesh and bone. In the forward torpedo room, a young seaman named Akira began to pray aloud, his voice rising in pitch until the petty officer beside him slapped him silent. But others were praying too, silently, to ancestors and to gods, to anyone who might have the power to stop the explosions that were methodically destroying their world. The submarine's depth gauge showed 160 meters and slowly increasing. They were sinking. Not quickly, not catastrophically, but the nose was heavy and the helmsman was fighting to maintain angle with the stern planes. The electric motors were drawing from batteries that were depleting with each passing minute. In perhaps 2 hours, they would be exhausted. Then the choice would be between suffocation or surface surrender. Matsumura made his decision. Helm, come right to course 180. All ahead 1/3. We'll try to slip beneath their sonar arc. It was a calculated risk. The movement would make noise, but staying still meant certain death. The submarine turned slowly, the sound of its electric motors rising just above the ambient level. In the American destroyer overhead, the sonar operator, a 19-year-old from Nebraska named James Morrison who had never seen the ocean until he joined the Navy, heard the change immediately. His right hand moved to the bearing indicator while his left reached for the telephone to the bridge. "Contact changing bearing, sir. Target is maneuvering." The destroyer's captain, Commander Robert Hayes, had sunk 2 Japanese submarines in the past 6 months. He knew the geometry of undersea pursuit like a chessmaster knows board positions. "Come right to 185. Slow to 2/3. Sonar, give me continuous bearing." The 7th charge fell as the I-21 was midway through its turn. It exploded 120 meters astern, the shock wave catching the submarine at an angle that magnified its effect. A battery cell in the aft electrical compartment cracked, spilling sulfuric acid onto the deck. The caustic liquid reacted with seawater from the leaks, creating a toxic gas that burned lungs and eyes. Men pulled wet cloth over their faces and continued their damage control work, coughing, tears streaming, because stopping meant dying. The torpedo room started flooding through a valve that had been damaged by the shock. The men there formed a human chain, passing buckets of water aft to be pumped overboard, a desperate effort to maintain trim. But the hand pumps were slow, and the leak was fast, and everyone could do the mathematics even if they refused to speak the conclusion aloud. In the archives of the Imperial Japanese Navy, preserved in the volumes that survived the war's destruction, there are action reports from submarines that encountered American depth charge attacks. The language is clinical, the prose detached, but between the lines of operational terminology lies a story of profound psychological trauma. Commanding officers reported crew members suffering from what they termed war neurosis, uncontrollable shaking, temporary blindness, paralysis, men who could no longer function after enduring hours of depth-charge barrages. Some submarines returned to base with crews so mentally shattered that they were removed from combat duty permanently. What the Americans called anti-submarine warfare, the Japanese submariners experienced as technological horror. It was the industrialization of death, the reduction of combat to mathematics and physics, and the cold application of scientific principles. There was no glory in it, no opportunity for valor or individual heroism. A submarine being depth-charged could not fight back, could not even see its attacker. It could only endure, and eventually break, and sink into darkness carrying its crew with it. The recurring sound that haunted every Japanese submariner who survived the war was that sonar ping. Veterans described hearing it in their sleep decades later, that sharp metallic tapping that meant they had been found, that the ocean had betrayed them, that death was calculating their position with mechanical precision. It was the sound of an invisible enemy that could see through water and darkness, that possessed weapons designed with the single purpose of crushing steel hulls and the men inside them. By contrast, the American sailors who operated the sonar systems and dropped the depth charges experienced the war in abstraction. They hunted echoes on a screen, mechanical traces that represented enemy submarines the way symbols on a map represent enemy positions. The sonar operator Morrison, listening through his headphones, tracked what he heard as the contact, not as 30 or 40 human beings, not as men with families and histories and hopes, but as a tactical problem to be solved. When a submarine was sunk, the evidence was often impersonal, an oil slick rising to the surface, debris, sometimes air bubbles marking the grave. The Americans might never know the name of the submarine they had killed, might never see the faces of the men who died. This distance, physical, technological, psychological, was itself a weapon, perhaps the most devastating one in the American arsenal. It allowed for killing without hesitation, for attack without doubt, for the destruction of enemy forces with the efficiency of an industrial process. The 8th depth charge came from the 2nd destroyer, approaching from a different angle. It exploded 100 meters forward of the I-21's position, the blast compressing the water in a shock wave that hit the bow like a hammer. The forward escape trunk seal failed. Water began pouring into the torpedo room at a rate that overwhelmed the bucket brigade in seconds. The petty officer in charge ordered the compartment sealed. 8 men were trapped on the wrong side of the watertight door, standing in water that was already up to their knees and rising. The sailor Akira was among them. He pressed his face against the small circular window in the door, looking into the control room where his friends stood on the dry side of the bulkhead. No one on either side of that door needed words to communicate what was happening. Matsumura made the decision that submarine captains pray they will never have to make. Seal the door. Maintain trim. The wheel was spun. The dogs engaged. The torpedo room and the 8 men in it were sacrificed to give the remaining 29 crew members a chance at survival. The men on the wrong side of the door did not scream or pound against the steel. They stood silently as the water rose to their waists, their chests, their necks. They died as they had been taught to die, without complaint, without visible fear, for the Emperor and for their comrades. But the sacrifice bought only minutes. The I-21 was mortally wounded. The list to starboard had increased to 15 degrees. The depth was now 170 meters and increasing. The battery acid leak in the aft compartment was getting worse, and men were passing out from the fumes. The hull groaned continuously now, a sound like distant thunder that resonated through the steel structure. The submarine was being compressed by the pressure of the deep, its structural members flexing beyond their design limits. Ping, ping, ping. The Americans continued their methodical work. The 9th depth charge exploded at the perfect depth, 140 meters, directly abeam of the submarine's midpoint. The blast was not louder than the others, but its placement was catastrophic. The pressure hull ruptured in 3 places. The sea, which had been probing and testing and waiting with infinite patience, finally found its way inside. Water entered the submarine at a pressure of 15 atmospheres, a solid column of destruction that swept men aside like dolls, that filled the compartments faster than doors could be closed, that crushed lungs and broke bones and carried away everything not bolted down. In the control room, the water rose from ankle-deep to chest-deep in less than 30 seconds. Matsumura stood at his post, his hand still on the periscope housing, maintaining the posture of command even as the ocean claimed his vessel. Lieutenant Sasaki, the executive officer who had thought himself beyond fear, found that he was crying, not from terror but from a profound sadness that this was how his story would end, in darkness and cold, with no witness and no memorial. The submarine's descent accelerated. The depth gauge needle swung past 200 meters, past 250, past 300. At some point during that fall, perhaps at 350 meters, perhaps deeper, the remaining compartments of the pressure hull imploded. The steel structure that had been designed to withstand the pressure of the deep finally surrendered to forces that exceeded its tolerances. The implosion was instantaneous. The men remaining alive died without time to register their deaths, their bodies crushed by a wall of water moving at supersonic speed. The I-21 continued to fall, tumbling end over end, leaving a trail of debris and oil that rose slowly toward the surface. On the American destroyer overhead, sonar operator Morrison heard the sounds of breakup, sharp cracking noises followed by a diminishing rumble that faded into the ambient noise of the sea. He had heard these sounds before. He knew what they meant. Contact lost, sir. Target destruction noises confirmed. Commander Hayes nodded. Secure from attack. Resume patrol. In his final report, filed 3 days later at Pearl Harbor, Hayes would note the sinking of one enemy submarine, probable I-class, with all hands lost. The action had consumed 43 minutes from initial contact to final destruction and had required 9 depth charges. It was considered an efficient kill. Morrison would be commended for his sonar work. The destroyer's crew would paint a small Japanese naval ensign on the bridge wing, the 9th such flag in a row that marked their victories. Between December 1941 and August 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 128 submarines to enemy action. Of these, the majority were sunk by American destroyers, destroyer escorts, and patrol craft using sonar-guided depth charge attacks. The mathematics of submarine warfare in the Pacific were brutal and unforgiving. Japanese submarines, designed for fleet operations and long-range patrols, proved vulnerable to an American anti-submarine campaign that combined technological superiority with industrial scale. For every American submarine lost in the Pacific, the Japanese lost nearly 3 of their own. And while American submarines devastated Japanese merchant shipping, sinking more than 5 million tons of cargo vessels, Japanese submarines achieved only a fraction of that destruction. The reasons for this disparity were numerous and complex, but they centered on the fundamental difference in how the two nations approached undersea warfare. Japan's submarines were built around the concept of decisive fleet action, with large, fast boats designed to attack enemy warships in support of surface engagements. American submarines, by contrast, were optimized for commerce raiding, with smaller, more maneuverable boats designed to hunt merchant vessels. And when it came to defending against submarines, The Americans applied lessons learned from 2 years of British experience in the Atlantic, deploying sonar systems and depth charges with a proficiency that Japanese anti-submarine forces never matched. But beyond tactics and technology, there was something else, a difference in industrial philosophy that manifested in how the war was fought beneath the waves. American destroyers carried 40 to 60 depth charges and could be resupplied at sea from dedicated ammunition ships, allowing them to prosecute attacks with what seemed like unlimited munitions. American shipyards produced depth charges by the thousands, along with sonar systems that were constantly being improved and refined based on combat experience. Training programs for sonar operators graduated hundreds of specialists each month, feeding the fleet with skilled operators who could hunt submarines with professional competence. It was abundance translated into naval warfare. The same abundance that produced 50,000 tanks and 300,000 aircraft and tens of millions of tons of shipping also produced the tools of anti-submarine warfare in numbers that overwhelmed Japanese defenses. A Japanese submarine that survived one depth charge attack might face a dozen more before its patrol ended. The Americans could afford to expend hundreds of depth charges hunting a single target. They could afford to build more destroyers than Japan had submarines. They could afford to train operators and develop tactics and refine equipment until the science of submarine detection became a form of industrial art. The men who survived depth charge attacks carried those experiences for the rest of their lives. In the years after the war, in the quiet suburbs of rebuilt Japanese cities, veterans of the submarine service would sometimes wake in the night, hearts racing, hearing in their memory that sharp metallic sound. Ping, ping, ping. Some refused to take baths, unwilling to submerge themselves in water. Others could not tolerate enclosed spaces, could not ride in elevators or sit in rooms without windows. They had learned in the most visceral way possible what it meant to be hunted by a technologically superior enemy, to be reduced from warriors to targets, to experience the absolute helplessness of modern industrial warfare. A few wrote memoirs, though most did not. The culture of Japanese naval service did not encourage public reflection on defeat or suffering. But in the limited accounts that exist, common themes emerge: the claustrophobia of the submarine under attack, the way time seemed to stretch during depth charge runs, the taste of fear mixing with machine oil and battery acid, the faces of crewmates who did not survive. And always that sound. The sonar ping that announced they had been found, that their invisibility had been stripped away, that the ocean itself had become their enemy. One survivor, a former lieutenant commander named Toshio Miyamoto, wrote in a private journal discovered after his death, "We thought we were the hunters. We believed our training and our honor made us invincible. But the Americans taught us that modern war cares nothing for honor. It is a machine that grinds and crushes and consumes, and the side with the better machine wins. We were samurai fighting against factories, and factories cannot be defeated with courage alone." The recurring symbol of American technological dominance, in these accounts and in the official records, was the depth charge itself. To the Japanese submariners, it represented something beyond mere weaponry. It embodied the American approach to war, overwhelming force, applied with scientific precision, backed by seemingly unlimited resources. Each depth charge was a product of American industry, manufactured in facilities that operated around the clock, filled with explosives synthesized in chemical plants, fused with devices that represented the cutting edge of mechanical engineering. Thousands of these weapons were produced each month, shipped across the Pacific, and dropped into the ocean in patterns calculated to maximize the probability of kill. The Japanese could not match this production. Their industry was strained to breaking point, maintaining aircraft and warship construction. Depth charge production was a low priority. Anti-submarine warfare doctrine was underdeveloped. Sonar technology lagged years behind American and British systems. By 1943, the Imperial Navy submarines were being hunted by an enemy that possessed technological superiority in every relevant category: detection, weapons, tactics, training, and industrial capacity. In the deeper currents of history, the fate of boats like the I-21 represents more than military statistics or tactical analysis. It reveals the fundamental transformation of warfare in the 20th century, the shift from combat as individual contest to combat as industrial process. The submarine crews of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been trained in a tradition that emphasized spiritual strength and warrior virtue. They believed, as their nation believed, that will and courage and devotion to the emperor could overcome material disadvantage. They were the inheritors of a military culture that dated back centuries, to the era of samurai and swords and personal honor. But sonar and depth charges did not care about honor. Physics and chemistry and mathematics did not acknowledge spiritual strength. The Americans won beneath the waves not because they were braver or more devoted to their cause, though many were both brave and devoted, but because they possessed better tools and more of them, because their industrial system could produce sophisticated equipment in volumes that Japan could not match, because they approached warfare as an engineering problem to be solved with technology and resources rather than as a test of character. This was perhaps the most profound lesson of the Pacific Submarine War, though it was a lesson that applied to every theater and every form of combat in World War II. The side that could detect targets more accurately, deliver weapons more precisely, produce equipment more prolifically, and sustain operations more persistently would win, regardless of the individual courage of soldiers or the strategic brilliance of commanders. Industrial capacity had become the ultimate weapon, and America's industrial capacity was a force of nature that no adversary could withstand. The depth charge barrage, guided by sonar, was merely one expression of this fundamental reality. But for the men who experienced it, who heard the metallic pinging of sound waves mapping their position, who felt the hammer blows of explosions walking closer with each attack, who watched their vessels rupture and flood and sink into darkness, it was the entire universe of modern war concentrated into a few cubic meters of steel and a few terrifying minutes of time. Today, the wrecks of Japanese submarines lie scattered across the Pacific floor, silent graves marking the trajectories of depth charge attacks that ended decades ago. The ocean has reclaimed them, covering their steel hulls with coral and sediment, turning instruments of war into artificial reefs where fish now shelter. The men who died inside them are dust, if anything remains at all. The destroyers that sank them have long since been scrapped, their steel recycled into new purposes. The sonar operators who guided the attacks have passed away, taking with them the memory of how those echoes sounded in their headphones. But the lesson remains, preserved not in monuments or memorials, for there are few of those for submarine crews, who died unseen and often unrecorded, but in the technological legacy that shaped naval warfare for the rest of the century and beyond. Sonar became ever more sophisticated, evolving from active pinging to passive listening arrays that could detect submarines from hundreds of miles away. Depth charges gave way to homing torpedoes and rocket-launched weapons. The cat-and-mouse game between submarine stealth and surface ship detection continued through the Cold War and into the present, an endless technical race between invisibility and detection. And in that race, in the fundamental dynamic of hunter and hunted beneath the waves, the principles established in the Pacific War remain. The side with better sensors, better weapons, better training, and more resources holds the advantage. Courage and skill matter, but they matter within the framework established by technology and industrial capacity. The ocean is no longer a place where submariners can hide simply by diving deep. It is a medium filled with sound, mapped by sensors, controlled by nations that possess the technical means to detect and destroy anything that moves within it. This is the legacy of the depth charge barrages that terrified Japanese submarine crews, not just the individual tragedies of boats like the I-21 and the men who died in them, but the transformation of undersea warfare from an art of stealth and surprise into a science of detection and destruction. The ocean's darkness, which once provided concealment, became transparent to sonar. The deep, which once provided sanctuary, became a trap for submarines whose hulls could not withstand the pressure when damaged by near-miss explosions. The silent service became the detected service, hunted by enemies who could hear through water and kill from the surface with mechanical precision. For the submariners who experienced this transformation, who survived patrols that their comrades did not, the memory was inescapable. Some spent the rest of their lives trying to forget. Others felt an obligation to remember, to bear witness to what had happened beneath the waves where no cameras recorded and no journalists observed. But all of them carried the knowledge that they had participated in a form of warfare where technology had stripped away every advantage that training and courage could provide, where survival became a matter of chance and physics rather than skill and determination. In the end, perhaps this is the truest testament to what American abundance and industrial power meant in World War II. Not just the ability to build more ships and planes and tanks, but the capacity to transform the fundamental nature of combat itself, to make the old virtues insufficient and the old tactics obsolete, to win not through superior spirit but through superior systems. The depth charge barrage was democracy's answer to the warrior code, not an argument made in words or philosophy, but a statement delivered in explosives and sound waves, saying that industrial societies would triumph over martial cultures, that factories would defeat devotion, that the nation which could produce the most sophisticated weapons in the greatest quantities would write the terms of peace. And in the cold darkness of the Philippine Sea, at a depth where sunlight never penetrates and pressure crushes steel, The wreck of the I-21 rests as a monument to that truth, its hull crushed, its crew gone, its war long finished, but its story echoing still in the history of how wars are fought and won and lost in the modern age.